Hello, this video continues our work in People, Planet, Profit, and Planet. So we're into week 6 of this semester, and this week we're talking about government regulation and policy. So we're going to be covering chapters 7 and 8 in our textbook. So these are the learning objectives from chapter 7. I'm not going to take the time to read them to you. You can familiarize yourself with them. They're listed in the textbook and in the PowerPoint for the course. Okay, so how do businesses and government work together? We've discussed this a little bit in previous chapters, and we're going to be talking about government regulation in future chapters also, as it is a complex relationship that touches on so many different issues that we'll be discussing. But really, that one, businesses are impacted by by a nation's values, customs. They're impacted by government regulations. Also, governments are regulated by impacted by business because it supports their economic structure. Okay, businesses and governments can work together or against each other. So they can cooperate and have collaborative partnerships, work for mutually beneficial goals. They can work in opposition of each other. And in fact, they might do both at the same time. Okay, so depending on how large an organization is, they might be collaborating with the government on one aspect or product while being in opposition to the government on another aspect of the business or product. Okay, most of these two chapters are focused on U.S.-based businesses and interactions with the U.S. government, but there is some discussion, just a very little bit in the chapter, about global business. And if a company is global and working in multiple countries, they have to comply with the different regulations in those different countries. So they have to understand the government, the culture, the customs of multiple countries and adjust how they interact with the government as necessary. Okay, so what does the government do? Well, the government creates public policy. So really what public policy is doing is what are the government's goals for how they either benefit or punish citizens. So how do we work with citizens? What are our goals for encouraging people to go into business? What are our goals for education? Our goals for public infrastructure like roads, bridges. Also, part of public policy is education, as K through 12 education is a purview of the government. So a wide variety of things that we can be looking at as part of what is public policy. Of course, this policy goals can change from administration to administration. So generally each administration kind of has their own pet projects and things that they're in favor of or against. And so public policy can also change as an impact of administration changes. So if we have a new president every 4 years, we can actually have public policy changes every 4 years. This sometimes can also be difficult for businesses when they're trying to do long-term strategic planning, when they're trying to determine what it would be the impact of an administration change and what kind of policies would come out of that administration change. Okay, multiple types of public policy. So first we have economic policies. So we have fiscal policy, which is how the government decides that it spends its money. So the government collects taxes, they collect fees, they collect duties, tariffs, they get money in multiple different ways. They sell bonds and other instruments to raise money. And they have to decide how are they going to spend that money. Do they spend it on education? Do they spend it on healthcare costs? Do they spend it on infrastructure? So repairing roads and bridges and keeping infrastructure up. Do they build new buildings? Do they support? So really, what kinds of things are they going to spend that money on? And how are they going to do that? Monetary policy. So policies that affect the supply, demand, and value of a nation's currency. So governments have control of how much money is out in the world. They can increase the amount, so print more money, or they can decrease the amount by bringing money in. So that's where the supply and demand come in. Monetary policy also impacts interest rates, impacts inflation, impacts how much things cost, sales taxes. Okay, so other kinds of economic policies, we have taxes. So we pay taxes for a wide variety of things, and what that tax policy looks like. So businesses, how they're taxed, or individuals, how they're taxed. Also, creating incentives. So last week we talked about environmental incentives in the way of tax breaks or tax credit. That is a public policy by saying, I'm going to give money back to the public if they do certain behaviors. So if you buy an electric car, you can get money back. If you lower your carbon footprint, the government's going to give you more grants. We might provide grant funding for research, or grant funding for going to clean energy. All of that is policy decisions. Okay, so industrial policy. So directing economic resources towards the development of specific industries. One example of this industrial policy would be a bill that passed during the Biden administration to improve infrastructure and increase manufacturing of computer chips. So there's a worldwide global shortage of computer chips that has been going on since 2020. Well, at the same time, with technological changes and technological demands, the demand for computer chips continues to outpace the supply of different kinds of chips. So one of the things that business or governments are doing is putting money into improving their infrastructure and trying to become the global entity in charge of who supplies the most computer chips. Several countries have put a lot of investment into chip manufacturing, including the United States. Okay, trade policy. Trade policy normally comes in the form of tariffs. So if you've been paying attention to the news at all in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months, there has been a lot of discussion of tariffs, as this is one of the ways that Trump really prefers to manage trade policy. This was similar to his first presidency in 2016. trade policy, the purpose of trade policy or tariffs is really to protect the economy and the businesses of the country who's creating the tariff. So, for example, when in 2016, when the tariffs were really focused around like steel, the steel industry, and there's a case at the end of this chapter about steel tariffs, is that we wanted to say if you want to bring steel in from other countries, we're going to add tariffs to them so they're more expensive to buy, because we would rather have you buy steel from U.S. manufacturers. So by creating the tariffs, we're going to make those products more expensive to purchase, so people are incentivized to buy U.S. products. Okay. We also have current trade policy thing that is happening right now, went into effect at the end of August, was the end of the de minimis exception. So we used to have a rule that said if you were sending low-cost shipments, so your shipments were less than $800, you didn't have to pay tariffs and duties on them, and you could circumvent a lot of the customs inspections. So Trump signed an executive order that got rid of that de minimis provision that had been in place for a very long time. And so now there's no longer that kind of, as long as my shipment is less than $800, then I don't have to comply with these different kinds of rules or pay these different kinds of tariffs and duties and stuff. And so that has been removed, and it was reduced down to shipments of less than $100 that are citizen to citizen rather than business to citizen. The reasoning behind that is looking at different kind of policies, and I encourage you to, of course, look any of these things up and learn more about them. I highly believe in informed populace, and that people should be aware of the kinds of decisions that are being made. Okay, social assistance policies. So these are policies that concern social services for citizens. These can be anything from food stamps to educational programs to healthcare subsidies. Okay, and then of course the government regulates. So they create rules of conduct for citizens and organizations in the form of laws and regulations. So those laws and regulations help them to accomplish public policy. So how can governments regulate businesses, and should they? Okay, so one of the arguments is that the market, one of the arguments is that the government should stay out of business completely. That the market will regulate itself, that if consumers want certain things from businesses, they will demand it, and then businesses will comply to the consumer's wishes. The issue with this is, so we have the market failure, is that this doesn't hold true. And a lot of this comes from like food contamination standards. If businesses aren't forced to comply to government regulation of safety standards, contamination standards, what actually happens is the food starts being contaminated all of the time. We start getting diseases in food. The truth is that businesses just are not willing to pay for those preventative measures unless they're forced to. Actually, one of the things that I found interesting was that before the Food and Drug Administration was created and started regulating, food safety, companies did do stuff with milk. One of the things was that milk is that, like, in the 1800s, dairy producers would put chalk in their milk to make it look better. And it would often be full of bacteria, but the chalk to make it look white, even if it wasn't safe to drink. And so looking at that, that's one of the kind of main things, is that those safety standards and food contamination and stuff really falls by the way if the government isn't regulating it. Businesses don't voluntarily keep things safe. Okay. We have, of course, if there's unintended costs of regulation, so we get, it costs a lot of money to comply to regulations. It certainly costs more money to be safety compliant than it does to not be safety compliant. And so those costs get passed on. Okay. Other ways that governments get in is with monopolies and kind of antitrust in business. So wanting to prevent monopolies, okay, and to come in, because if there's no competition, then firms raise prices as much as they want. So the government tries to encourage that there is competition. So when businesses start to buy out their competitors, the government generally steps in and tries to make sure that that purchase is not an anti-competitive thing. I know we've talked before about Disney's purchase of Fox, and how because Disney already owned ESPN and ABC, and several other news stations, that the government decided that if they also owned Fox News and Fox Sports, that they would be too much of a monopoly and they would own far too much of the market, and there would be no competitors left in those arenas. Another example of natural monopolies is electric services. Cell phones actually also have this. So a company comes in and they put in cell phone towers, they put in power lines, they put in internet service like that, and then because they paid for those utilities to be laid, they want to be the only company to get that money back. So sometimes governments will come in and they'll say, okay, yes, you are the only electric company available in this area, and that's okay, but you can't charge so much that people cannot afford to turn on their lights. Another way that governments regulate are through ethical things. So ethical and fairness, and one of those ways, the book talks about the UK Modern Slavery Act. The U.S. also has a recent Slavery Act put into place, and has done some investigations into countries like China, where transparency is very difficult to get because of how their country is governed. There are a lot of reports of slavery in China, and companies that are using slave labor, and we'll look about that more when we get into some industry specific topics. But, trying to prevent slavery, saying that people have to be paid a certain amount of money, or, like a living wage can be a type of regulation. So that's where things like minimum wage laws come in. So there's this fairness. Human resource laws to try to prevent discrimination and bias in hiring by saying that you should hire the most qualified person for the position, regardless of race, different kind of policies that they put in place for these things. Okay, and we'll continue in the next video.